daughter's death to build me the most magnificent church you can conceive. If you do that, I will pay you a king's ransom. However, if you do not complete this church within 1 year, I will pay you absolutely nothing. Well, folks, they got busy. They worked around the clock, and they completed this church in 361 days. They cut it close, but they got their money. And this is our stop number 8. This is Flashback Memorial Presbyterian Church. Please exit only on the right after I ring the bell. Now, inside this church is a mausoleum, and inside that mausoleum is buried Henry Flagler with his first wife, which is Jenny Louise's mother. Also buried here is Jenny Louise with her daughter Marjorie in her arms. Now, there is room for one more person in that mausoleum. Henry had a son. His son's name was Harry. Henry and Harry never got along. Harry's buried in New York. You don't mess with Henry. Nobody on? Nobody off. This trolley's back in motion. Now, it might seem like Henry Flagler came to St. Augustine to build churches, but that was never his intent. His idea was to come down here and build a whole bunch of very nice hotels. Now, his very first hotel was a Hotel Ponce de Leon, built in 1888. It was the crown jewel of his hotels. It was the most prestigious hotel in the world and way ahead of its time. It had running water and electricity in every single room. Folks, it'd be 5 years before even the White House would have electricity at that time. Wow. Now, the Hotel Ponce de Leon is now Flagler College right here on my right. Now, there was a little problem with the electricity back then that even Henry Flagler could not have anticipated. You see, electricity was such a new concept that many of Henry Flagler's guests were terrified to even touch the light switches. So Henry Flagler had to hire men to stand outside each and every room and turn the lights on and off as the guests came and went throughout the day. That's prestige. Now, all the electricity for this hotel was generated right on site in the building on my right. It housed 3 giant generators that were installed and designed by Thomas Edison himself. Yes. By the way, Thomas Edison was a close friend to Henry Flagler. Now, those generators are gone. They now reside at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, this hotel was only open 100 days a year from December to Easter. It was also by invitation only. Now, if you were lucky enough to be invited by Henry Flagler to stay at his magnificent hotel, you had to pay for all 100 days. When you stayed 1 day, 10 days a month, or all 100 days would cost you $9,000 to stay here. Now, folks, that is 300 grand in today's money. Now, there was one exception to that rule. If you were a sitting president, you could stay here for free as often as you liked. And there were 5 presidents that took Henry Flagler up on that offer. The last president to stay here was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And it's so nice to talk about something that happened here in St. Augustine. It happened while I was still alive. Now, in 1966, this hotel closed its doors as a hotel, and we opened a year later in 1967 as a women's college. Now, this college has since become co-ed, but it's still exclusive and private. And that part of the building that juts on a semicircle, that is the dining hall. And it seats over 650 people. It also features 80 panes of Tiffany glass, designed and installed by Louis Comfort Tiffany himself. They have an estimated value of well over $130 million. Now, I can't really appreciate that glass from here because it's covered up with bulletproof and hurricane-proof plexiglass. Now, this entire hotel was built out of poured concrete, and that was a relatively new building material back then. And it was introduced to Henry Flagler by his very good friend, Franklin Smith. Now, Franklin Smith is a wealthy man in his own right, an avid traveler and collector. Now, he discovered poured concrete while visiting Europe one time. And that was very interesting to Franklin Smith because he had always wanted to build himself a winter home here in St. Augustine. But he wasn't real crazy about the hurricanes we sometimes get here in the summer. He didn't want his winter home blown away in the summer when he wasn't here. Well, once he learned about poured concrete and its ability to withstand hurricane-force winds, that was a go for Franklin Smith. He went ahead and designed and built himself a 1/10 replica of one wing of the Alhambra Hotel in Spain. And that structure is right in front of my trolley to the left across the street. It looks like a castle. That is the Villa Zareta. It was the winter home for Franklin Smith. Now, that's no longer a winter home for anybody. It's now a museum. It's also an excellent example of the poured concrete process. You can see the striations on the wall where the concrete wooden forms are built. The concrete poured. Once it dries, the forms are removed. And you keep up that process until you have a building. Now, the Villa Zareta Museum is an eclectic collection of artifacts from around the world spanning over 2,000 years. In fact, inside this building, There is a 2,000-year-old Egyptian rug made entirely out of cat hair. There's a joke there somewhere, folks. I'm working on it.
Cat hair?
Now, inside the museum is a self-guided tour. You're given an MP3 player to use while you're here that will guide you from room to room, describing its contents in one of three languages: French, Spanish, or English. There's also a meditation room here at the museum, so I'm not allowed to ring my trolley bell at this stop. So I'll have to come up with some clever, witty way to let you know that it's safe to exit my trolley. At stop number 9, this is the Villa Zareta Museum. Please exit only on the right-hand side at this stop. Ding ding. Or should I say meow? Now there's much more pedestrian items inside that museum. It's not all. There is also a mummified foot, but
What?
those are the two creepiest things. The rest of the hotel is so very, very fascinating.
Let me see.
Way back. Some really good stuff
I
here.
don't need to see that one.
Okay. Everybody's on. Nobody off. This trolley's back in motion. Ding ding.
Ding ding dong.
Well, let's see if anybody lets me in the line here at King, back onto King Street. Now, right in front of my trolley is Flagler College, once Hotel Ponce de Leon. Folks, at this time, I always like to take just an extra second and admire the architecture of that building. They don't build them like that anymore.
Nope.
This was inspired by
Let's clear the sidewalk.
Sorry.
Now, in front of the college, there is a statue of Henry Flagler. Now, that statue originally stood at the train depot here in St. Augustine. But when that Lightner Museum opened up in the early 1900s, Henry Flagler was moved down to the Lightner Museum. And then in 1967, when the college opened up, he simply walked across the street, and there he stands.
What is Charlie right there?
I think that's an appropriate place for Henry Flagler in front of his college.
His flag.
Now, as we go by Henry Flagler, he's there on the left. You might notice he's got one hand in his pocket. The local folks say he's hanging on to the very first dollar he ever made.
He doesn't.
That was kind of a cheap shot. He's actually was actually a very generous man.
There's got to be a pull factor for this race.
Now, right across the courtyard, where once stood the Olivet Methodist Church, that's that little tiny Olivet church that Henry Flagler paid $4,000 to replace with an $84,000 church right down the street. So in essence, he paid 88 grand for that little piece of property, which back then had a value of about $3,500. But he had to do that, folks, because
Prices have gone up so much.
that little tiny church was blocking the view of his magnificent second church, or hotel, the Alcazar, which is now the Lightner Museum. Now, Otto Lightner was a publisher. He published the magazine, The Hobbyist. And he thought everybody should have a hobby. His hobby was collecting other people's collections.
Uh-oh.
Now, his collections in Chicago outgrew his studio. And after staying at the, here in St. Augustine at the Alcazar, he fell in love with St. Augustine and fell in love with that hotel. So he bought the hotel and turned it into his museum. He moved everything down here. Now the Lightner Museum features mainly Victorian pieces. However, through the years, it's become a bit more eclectic. You never know what you're going to find at the Alcazar. One thing I can promise you, folks, is there's a lot to see here. This museum is chock full. Now this stop, please exit only on the left-hand side of my trolley. And remember to back down off the trolley backwards like you're climbing down a ladder, utilizing the uprights and handholds. And this is stop number 10, the Lightner Museum. Left side only. Nobody off. This trolley is in motion, folks. Now you'll notice Henry Flagler built his second hotel, the Alcazar, right across the street. from his #1 hotel, the Hotel Ponce de Leon. That's because, believe it or not, even at $9,000 a visit, he managed to overbook that hotel. So he built the Alcazar as an overflow to the Hotel Ponce de Leon. And while he was at it, he made it affordable. It was only a few dollars a night for a room, and it also featured bowling, gambling, billiards, and the biggest swimming pool thought to exist at that time. Now, as we head down Granada Street, take a look to your left, about halfway down the block. There is a part of that building that juts out in a semicircle into the sidewalk. That is just one end of that swimming pool. That swimming pool continued all the way across the building and jutted out into Cordova Street the same way on the other side. It was huge. Now, if you were lucky enough to catch a swim at the Alcazar pool, you could look up and watch people dance to live orchestra music on the balcony that surrounded that pool. Now, behind the pool, or behind the Red Hotel, were the asphalt tennis courts, and back then, women were not allowed to play tennis. It was considered undignified. I'd love to know what Billie Jean King would have to say about that back then. Now, Lincolnville is an historic part of our city coming up. It also played a crucial role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Now, right across my trolley, across that street, is St. Mary's Baptist Church. In that church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave rally speeches and sermons.
Really?
Now, back in the 1960s, during the civil rights period, black people were not allowed to gather in public, so they held their rallies inside buildings like this church on my right, the Trinity Independent Church. And Dr. King also spoke at that church, at the Trinity Independent Church. Now, right here on our left is the Accord Civil Rights Museum, the former dentist office of Dr. Robert Ailing. Now, he was the very first black dentist in the country, also a very active member in the NAACP. Now, coming up right here on the left-hand side of my trolley, the White House with the red trim belongs to Miss Cora Tyson. She is a contemporary of Dr. Martin Luther King and is a frequent guest in her home throughout the civil rights movement.